Life is a long highway and I'm just doing the best I can.
Well, welcome back to the Straight Line to Success. And I am so excited to have my good friend Carl Muller in the studio with us today. Carl, welcome in and thank you for being with us. You know, you are a lawyer that has had an incredibly successful career, still, you know, kicking it. And I guess corporate and litigation is how you would describe the fields that you work in. And I would just say welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here, David. Thanks for asking.
So again, I appreciate you spending some time with our listeners today to talk about, this is a success and leadership podcast. And, you know, some people talk about the straight line to success. There is no straight line to success. And as our friend Coach Jeffries talks about, well, David, I kind of like that because when you look back, it is a straight line, you know? And so, you know, from being in South Carolina and going to Harvard undergrad, Harvard Law School, Harvard MBA, and of course, being a past president of the Harvard Alumni Association. I mean, whatever prompted you to have that much drive to do those things?
Well, let me first mention Harvard. My wife, who did not go to Harvard, refers to all that Harvard stuff as preparation H. So you don't want to get too carried away with that sort of stuff. You know, it's hard to say where the ambition and where the drive comes from. I grew up on a farm,
okay,
in the middle of nowhere in South Carolina.
Where was middle of nowhere?
It was Blythewood, which is now a suburb of Columbia. But back in the day, it was Booniesville.
Okay.
And there was one general store in town. It wasn't even a town. It was just a general store. And there was a family there, and they had two boys and two girls. And the two boys were good friends of mine, and they went to Harvard. So it was assumed that if you were going to go to college from that little town, that little school, you were going to go to Harvard. So that's what I did. I just followed in their wake.
That's pretty cool right there. And so you grew up on a farm, and did you have brothers and sisters?
Had a brother, still have a brother, and have two sisters. Yeah.
And now where did you fall in that lineup?
I was second.
Second in the lineup.
Yeah.
And what were y'all growing on the farm?
We raised everything except pigs because my father said that pigs were nasty. He didn't want to have anything to do with pigs. But we had everything else. We had chickens, we had ducks, we had corn, we had wheat, we had horses, cows, mules, even had a goat.
Wow.
So it was a big farm, but, you know, it took a lot of work to keep it going. So when my brother and I went off to college, my father sold the farm because he, number one, needed money to send us to college, and number two, he didn't have anybody to help him work it. He said he'd seen enough people get old and die on a farm. He didn't want to be doing that himself. So the farm was there for a while, and I'll always remember that he said it served its purpose. People asked him, "Don't you wish you had the farm?" And he said, "No." He said, "I don't wish I still had the farm." He said, I got the farm to raise my children on the farm, same as he had grown up on the farm. Yeah. He said, and once that was done, it had served its purpose, and we did something else.
That's fantastic. Now, so talk about a little bit in terms of when you went to Harvard. I mean, you said you just saw that was the way to go. Did you have what was the adjustment like getting to Boston and being in that environment?
So when I got there, I looked around and I said, man, this is the place for me. Okay. I mean, it felt right. But I also knew that I'd come from a small country school, and there were lots of other people there from really sophisticated high schools and prep schools. And I thought to myself, Carl, you gotta buckle down. You gotta study because you don't want to flunk out and go back home with your tail between your legs. So that's what I did. I worked and I studied, and I did well. And then when I did well, the first time they had exams, I said, I think I can handle this.
That's awesome. So went to Harvard, put a lot of pressure on yourself not to fail, and you succeeded, and then got into the practice. So tell us, how did you choose? I mean, it sounds like you had a lot of opportunities. How did you choose the firm that you started with?
So here's the story on that. Like I said before, my wife did not go to Harvard, and I was going to be an investment banker in New York City.
Okay.
And when we got ready to decide where to go, we were not married at the time. We were engaged. She said, Carl, do not go to New York City and be an investment banker. And I said, why not? And she said, if you do that, you will make $1 gazillion, but you will have no idea who your children are. And I said, so what do you want to do? And she said, I think we should go to Greenville, South Carolina, and you should practice with that firm that Alfred Burgess is in. It was Weich, Burgess, Freeman, and Parham. Her family, she was from New York, had known the Burgesses because the girls in both families had gone to the same college, Randolph-Macon Women's College. And she said, that's a fine family. She said, it's a good firm. She said, let's go to Greenville. And I said, hey, okay, if that's what you want to do, we'll give it a go.
And your wife's name?
Allison.
Allison. So Allison sort of, she told you what was up early in your marriage.
She picked it.
Even before you were married.
She picked it. I've listened to her all my life, and that's part of the straight line of success is find somebody who's smarter than you are and listen to what they have to say.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. So, and you and I mean, you've been a mentor of mine. I've been very grateful for your influence on my life, and I've heard a lot of your stories. I know there's a lot that I haven't heard, but, talk a little bit about how you ended up at the Weich firm. I know you, had Allison telling you need to be in Greenville, but, you just don't get to sign up for a firm. You have to go through an interview process. And you have to like the people that you talked about. I know some of those guys were kind of colorful. How was that process?
So when I was in law school, I had a good friend who was a third-year student in law school. He was from South Carolina. He was from Dillon, African-American guy. And he had decided that he was going to interview everybody that came through Harvard Law School just to see what they were like.
Okay.
And so I was in my room one afternoon in the fall, and he comes knocking on the door, got his suit, coat and tie on. He says, Carl, he says, you need to put on a suit and go down to the Holiday Inn and talk to this man named David Freeman. And I said, who is he? And he said, well, he's got a firm in Greenville, South Carolina, and you would like him. And I said, well, I have no intention of going back to South Carolina or practicing law. So what's the point? He said, no, Carl. He says, you need to put on your suit and go down to the Holiday Inn where he is and go talk to him because he's your kind of guy. He said he grew up on a farm in Pickens, and he went to Harvard Law School, and you'd like him. And I said, well, like I said, why should I do that? And he said, let me ask you something. He said, is your time so important right now that you won't spend 45 minutes doing what I ask you to do? I said, okay, I'll put on my suit and go down there. So I put on my suit and I went down there to the Holiday Inn, knocked on the door. David Freeman opens the door. He's a big guy. He's not wearing any shoes. He's not wearing any coat. His tie's loose. He walks, he says, Carl, he says, come on in, pour yourself a drink. And he's got a bottle of bourbon on the nightstand. I pour myself a drink, and then he crawls up on the bed and sits on the bed and says, pull up a chair and let's talk. And so we started talking, and 2.5 hours later, I left the room, and I thought, yeah, David was right. He's a pretty good guy. He's a pretty good guy. So I stayed in touch with David Freeman and wound up taking a job at his firm.
So how about that? So almost sounds like you had to be talked into going down to meet him.
I did. Yeah.
And then so you ended up coming to work at that firm, right? The Weich firm.
Right. I did.
And practicing law wasn't the same as it is today. It's much more specialized today. But tell us about the early days of practicing with the Weich firm.
So I showed up at the law firm on July the 5th, 1977.
Okay.
Little tiny office on the bottom floor by the door across from the bathroom. And this guy walks into my office, one of the partners, and he says, Carl, he says, we want you to get on an airplane and go to Baltimore and buy 100 railroad boxcars. And I said, Mr. Cale, his name was Bill Cale. I said, Mr. Cale, all I know about railroad boxcars is that's controlled by the Interstate Commerce Act, which is the most complicated federal statute on the books. It's hundreds of pages long. I didn't take that in law school. I don't know anything about how to buy railroad boxcars. And he said, neither do we, but you went to Harvard, so you can figure it out. So I got on an airplane and I flew to Baltimore, and I spent 3 days negotiating how to buy these railroad boxcars. And the lawyer across the table from me was a former United States Senator, Joe Tidings. And the thing I remember most about him is that for half a day, he had his fly open. And I finally bought the railroad boxcars and came home. And I thought to myself, this is either the best firm I can be with or the craziest firm I can be with, that they would get me to do this. And after that, I figured, well, I can do anything.
Man, that's incredible. First week, you're buying boxcars. So, well, talk a little bit about, I can think of a number of cases that I know you've been involved in, but are there cases or things that in terms of your law practice that you're proud of that you've been associated with, or just find, fun to talk about?
Well, I represent a number of different types of companies and individuals, all the way from companies that are Fortune 500 companies. Was general counsel of Fortune 500 companies, all the way to down and out people. I mean, but just to give you an example,
Like me.
Well, not like you, but there was a boy at Greenville High,
Okay.
who was the grandson of a maid for one of my former, not current, but former law partners. And he was accused wrongly of receiving stolen goods because somebody had sold him a cell phone or some kind of video game or something. I can't remember quite now. It's been about 12 years.
Okay.
And he was charged with receiving stolen goods. And I knew that if that charge stuck, that would follow him for the rest of his life. So his grandmother, who I knew, asked me if I could help her. She was recommended to me by the firm that I had been with, White, Spurgis, Freeman, and Parham, because they didn't have anybody there that felt competent to handle it. So I took the case and I got him off. They dropped the charges against him, which they should have done.
Yeah.
And he came by my office and brought me a little Christmas cactus in a pot about the size of this coffee cup.
Yep.
And I've kept that Christmas cactus for the years, and that Christmas cactus has grown, and every Christmas it's wonderful.
Nice.
And that is one of the best cases I've ever had.
Wow. That's a great story, Carl.
That's one of the best cases I've ever had.
Man, that is good. And that, I guess that leads me to my next question. We talk about the success and leadership podcast, but success, I've found as talking to people, there's so many definitions of success. I mean, how do you define success?
Well, the first thing you got to do about success is you got to decide, like one of my old law partners told me years ago, he said, Carl, you got to decide what it is you want out of life. Okay. And that's different for everybody. There's some common things, but for me, it's doing right by your family. Okay.
Yeah.
Because if you don't do right by your family, as far as I'm concerned, nothing else much matters. It's sort of like Jackie Kennedy said, if you don't do right by your children, nothing else much matters. So, I try to do right by my family. And I think here in Greenville, we've been able to do that.
Yeah.
We've been able to do that. I got children who live all over the country right now. My son lives in Maine. One of my daughters lives in New York City, and I have another daughter who lives in Birmingham, Alabama.
What are their names real quick?
My son is named Wiley. My oldest daughter's named Lida, and my youngest daughter's named Amelia.
Okay.
But they've done well for themselves, and they feel like they had a good life growing up here, and that's important.
Yeah. So part of the success, if I heard you right, is to see your family succeed as well.
It is. And I'll say this, years ago at my 25th reunion at Harvard Business School, they have a big deal for the 25th and 50th reunions at Harvard. There was a program one of the afternoons called Success in Families. And I thought, well, this is just a way to sort of soft soap us to get us to give more money to Harvard. But and I'm not gonna fall for that. But I'll go by and see what it's all about. But it wasn't about that at all. It was about creating families that are important and that last across generations. And what the what the guy who was presenting said. He said, you spend your life building businesses. People spend their lives building businesses. He said, but that's not the most important thing. He said, because the businesses will disappear. He said, what'll last is the family. He said, and there are some families, a handful of families that are major families in America, and you know who they are. They're the Kennedys, the Rockefellers, the DuPonts, and others. He said, and they have built families across generations, sometimes as much as like 7 or 8 generations like the DuPonts. He said, and that's what you need to focus on is what are you going to do to create the family as the fundamental building block of your life. And I thought about that and I said, yeah, that's right. That's right. And so there are things that can be done to help that along. And I think that's important.
Yeah. Success, the family, your family success. Now let's talk about, being a lawyer and how do you define success in being a lawyer? And let's just, in South Carolina.
So lawyers are uniquely positioned to preserve the one thing that makes America different from every other country in the world, and that is freedom. If you look at how we got to where we were, it was because there were lawyers that happened to be around in the country in 1776 who put together the Declaration of Independence and then the Constitution of the United States. I mean, they built this country based on the concept of freedom and freedom for the individual. And as lawyers, we have a unique responsibility and we're uniquely positioned to protect freedom in America. And it doesn't make any difference how successful you are. If you don't have freedom, you don't have anything. So what I think is particularly important about the practice of law is not making money. It's not doing deals. It's not winning court cases. It's every day doing whatever I can in order to assure freedom for Americans.
Man, that's heavy duty right there, Carl. Freedom for Americans. So being successful in the practice of law in South Carolina requires us to remember, I guess, our history and our roots, and to make sure that the way we conduct ourselves helps preserve those freedoms.
That's right. That's right. And the cornerstone of that is truth. Without truth, you can't have freedom.
That's heavy duty right there. That's good stuff. I want to take you back to, I'm not sure what year it was, but you've spoken to my law school class about, I know you've represented several media clients, and a lot of times when there are media cases, there will be Freedom of Information Act requests on those types of clients. And, there is an obligation under the law, if you're a certain institution of public concern, that you produce records that, when you're asked to be produced. And I think you served one of those Freedom of Information Act requests, if I'm not mistaken, on an institution. And you may not be able to talk about this, but it was, I believe, down in Columbia, and it led you to a dump site. You ended up in the dump following the trail in this. Do you mind talking about that case a little bit?
I'll tell you about that case. That case was in, I think, 1987, long time ago. And it was against a so-called private foundation that was affiliated with the University of South Carolina. Back in the day, there was a president of the University of South Carolina named Jim Holderman who showed up here, and he was a celebrity. Yeah. And he was always doing big things. He brought the Pope to Columbia. He brought President Reagan to Columbia. I think George Rogers won the Heisman Trophy while the guy was president, and it's like, okay, this is just, then the hits just keep on coming for the University of South Carolina. And he wound up with an outsized ego, and he decided that he wanted to create these so-called private foundations so people would give money to the private foundations that otherwise would go to the University of South Carolina. And then he could keep under wraps everything that he wanted to do because it was his idea that the private foundations were not subject to the Freedom of Information Act and public oversight. He would just steer the money over to them. So the Greenville News and the Associated Press got wind of that, and they hired me to open it up. Well, I filed a lawsuit to do that, and because of his prominence, because of the president's prominence, just about every judge that touched that case gave it to another judge.
Hot potato.
And it wound up in the hands of the youngest circuit judge in the state at that time, and she ruled with me. Well, they immediately appealed it to the state Supreme Court, and during the appeal, which took several years, it turns out that the records that we were looking for disappeared. We didn't find that out until the state Supreme Court ruled with us. And by the way, on the eve of the first argument in the state Supreme Court, I received notice from the court that they canceled the argument the next day because 3 of the 5 justices had received gifts from the president of the University of South Carolina, and they said, we got a conflict. We cannot decide this case. So they then brought in a retired Chief Justice and 2 other circuit judges who heard the case later, and they all ruled with me. So I asked for the records, and they said, well, they were inadvertently thrown out by some dumb construction workers who were renovating the offices. Well, that sounded fishy.
Yeah.
So I said, when did you find that out? And they said, we found that out about 2.5 years ago. I said, well, why didn't you tell me at the time? And they sort of smiled and said, well, we didn't think you were going to win. So I went out and found the construction workers, and they said, no, we didn't throw those things away. They were in this room behind this big locked door, and it was full of boxes, and we just threw a few papers away that were lying in the hallway. So I thought to myself, let's see if we can find the records. And thinking it through, I decided that if the records were going to be destroyed, they had to be carried somewhere, and the way that they would be carried is by the low man on the totem pole, who would be the intern working for the private foundation. So I tracked him down in North Carolina, asked him if he had done it. He said that he had. He told me where he'd thrown them out in a landfill in Columbia, and we drove down from North Carolina there in a snowstorm, and he showed me where he thought he had dumped them. And then I called up SLED, because SLED was on the case. They were really just drinking coffee and eating donuts in their offices. They weren't paying attention to it. And I told them I wanted access to the landfill, and they said, are you crazy? And I said, well, maybe. I said, but I got permission from the judge to get in there. Now, are you going to let me in, or you want me to call the judge? So they came in and let me in. And the next Monday, I went down there and rented a track hoe. And we dug for a week until finally we dug up the records. We dug up an area the size of 2 football fields to a depth of 12 feet.
Wow.
And we found the records.
That's incredible. That is an incredible story. I remember, I mean, in all of this, all the while, I mean, that is a dogged personality. I mean, how did you get that? I mean, who instilled that in you, Carl? You're going to the landfill, dug up 2 football-sized fields to find these documents?
Well, I just wasn't going to get monkeyed with, okay? I mean, I just did not want to. I wasn't going to take it. So when I told the executive editor of the Greenville News what I had in mind, he said, are you going to do that? And I said, we can't not do that. We've got to do that. My partners thought I was crazy, and I probably was a little bit crazy.
Yeah.
But sometimes you got to be a little bit crazy just to get things done.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love that. I love that. Now, I mean, would you say that there's somebody, was your mom and dad, are those traits something? I mean, you said earlier you went to Harvard because you saw some young other kids in the hood, not the hood, but the neighborhood there, going from a small town. That's what we did. We went to Harvard. I mean, I love that and you, I guess, referenced that. Was there somebody that you saw that you would attribute this, or is this just natural, just the way you are? I mean,
Well, you know, my my father was the youngest A-26 pilot in World War II.
hmm.
He was flying an attack aircraft when he was 18.
What was his name?
Fred,
Okay.
George Frederick Mueller. He was flying an attack aircraft in World War II when he was 18 years old. Started out in North Africa, went across the Middle East into Southeast Asia, and wound up in China. And if there was going to be an invasion of Japan, he would have been in the invasion of Japan. Crashed twice, came back and graduated from Clemson, and always had the idea that you could do anything, as he said, you can do anything you're man enough to do. That's what he said. And he was very, very attuned to education. My mother had grown up in Greenville.
What was her name?
Her name was Catherine.
Okay.
She's almost 100 years old, by the way. She's 99 years, 4 months, and 13 days old.
Right now.
And I was with her in Columbia last Saturday, and she's still good. And until a couple months ago, she still played the piano.
Wow. What's her name again?
Catherine. Yeah. She was good. And they were always involved in the community, doing things, building things, working for others, and wanting to improve their lives and the lives of their children and the lives of, frankly, everybody around them. So I just had the idea that, you should do it. My father used to say, grab it and growl. And that's what we did. We just grabbed it and growled.
Man, that's fantastic. And, Carl, there's so many things that you've done. One of the things I know that when we first started working together for a mutual client, you were not available for some time because you were the president of the Harvard Alumni Association, and you basically toured the whole world. You went around the world. And I remember one specific story that you told me about. I believe it was it Hong Kong that you were asked to get up and speak?
Yeah, well, maybe what you're talking about is when I introduced the president of Harvard.
Yes.
So you're right. My wife and I, Alice and I, went around the world. We went around the United States, and then we traveled the world for Harvard. And one of the places we were at was Hong Kong, which was magnificent. And the president of Harvard came to Hong Kong the same time that I did. She came from one direction, I came from the other. And there was a huge gathering at one of the major hotels in Hong Kong for anybody who had any connection with Harvard. So it was a room that was filled up with about 1,000 people. And the president of the Harvard Club of Hong Kong was supposed to introduce the president of Harvard. But she came to me right before it was time. And she said, Carl, she says, I can't do it. She says, I can't stand up in front of that crowd and do that. She says, can you do that? So I said, yeah, sure, I can do that. So I got up and I introduced the president of Harvard to this crowd. And right before that, there had been some mention made that she was the 29th president of Harvard, or maybe the 28th or the 27th, something like that. So when I stood up, I said that I personally had known or worked with 6 of the presidents of Harvard, and there was sort of a gasp in the room. But that was a true statement. I said, of all those presidents, I said, Drew Faust, that was the president's name, was the best. And let me tell you why. And so I recounted why she was the best. And the crowd was just really in awe of that. And I looked down, the president was right there on the front row, and I was looking at me, and her eyes were sort of glistening. And so I introduced her, and she comes running up to the stage, throws her arms around me. She's a big woman, and just damn near knocked me over. And she said, Carl, no one's ever said anything like that about me. And I said, well, it's true. That's why I said it. And afterwards, some of the people from Hong Kong came up to me, and they said, you are a courageous person. And I said, why do you say that? And they said, well, you said that she was the best. They said, and what are all those other 5 going to think? You're going to have to watch out for yourself. And I realized that that's the way they think in Hong Kong and China. But that's not the way we think in America.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's a great story. And what an incredible and just life that you have had. And
But that was not the best introduction. The best introduction was with Oprah Winfrey.
oh, tell me about that. Tell us about that.
I was in charge of running Harvard's graduation, and Oprah Winfrey was the speaker, and so she was sitting next to me on the podium, and I introduced her, and it was sort of the same. It was sort of the same kind of thing. Everybody had been trying to glom on to Oprah, which she was not happy with at all. She would try to stand off from them. But when I got through introducing Oprah Winfrey, she threw her arms around me. She's also a big, strong woman, and damn near knocked me down too.
That's another great story. And of course, gave the commencement speech at least once that I have seen and enjoyed. Carl, what would you say to, I guess I would give you two scenarios because, your background in business, I think you've just seen so many different things. And so what would you advise a young entrepreneur or businessman in order to, what kind of advice would you give them in terms of finding success?
So when I was young, what I did at first is I said to myself how much money I wanted to make. All I could think about was just how much money I wanted to make. And that didn't do me any good. Just thinking about what you want is not going to get you what you want. So pretty soon I quit thinking about how much money I wanted to make. And I just started thinking about doing the best job I could at whatever it was that I was doing. And I figured that if I took care of that, everything else would take care of itself. And sort of along the way, I was in an airport one time, and I was reading a Barron's financial magazine, and in it they had a full-page ad that featured John Wooden, the famous coach, of UCLA, famous basketball coach of UCLA, and he said that it may surprise people, but he said, never once in my entire coaching career did I ever talk about winning. He said, I just told my players to pay attention to what they needed to do. And at the end of the game, they thought that the score would probably be something to their liking. And I looked at that and I thought I had played basketball in high school, and I really thought the world of John Wooden and the team. And I thought, if that's what he says, he's probably right. So I wrote Panhandle Eastern, which was a company that had sponsored this ad. It said, if you want a copy of this, write us. And so I wrote him a letter, and I got a copy of it. I framed it, and I put it on my wall. And that was 35 years ago, or maybe 40 years ago. And that's kind of what I've always followed. Every once in a while, at least once a week, I'll look up there at John Wooden, and I'll read what he has to say. And I'll just keep doing what I'm supposed to do. And at the end of the day, at the end of the week, at the end of the month, at the end of the year, things usually turn out pretty well.
And so that would be the advice you'd give, whether it was a young entrepreneur or business or a young litigator or lawyer.
Right. That's right. It's the same advice. And one other thing he said, we never scouted our opponents. He said it didn't make any difference to me how they played. He says, I didn't care whether a guard liked to drive to the outside or not. He said, you're never supposed to give anyone the outside, no matter who they are. He said, so we practiced on fundamentals. And that's what was important. He said, the other thing that was important, he said, when I recruited somebody, he said, I look for character. He said, I didn't just look for ability. He said, because ability may allow you to get to the top of your profession, but it won't allow you to stay there. He said, you can only stay there if you have character. And like I said earlier, character is fundamentally built on truth and concern for others. And that's what he looked for. And it obviously worked.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. So, Carl, again, I appreciate you spending some time with us and our audience today. And we could talk to you forever, and hopefully I'll have the good fortune of bringing you back. But is there anything that I haven't asked you that you want to say?
Yeah, I would say this. When I was about to graduate from Harvard Law School and Harvard Business School, Harvard had a competition for graduating students to write what would be a brief commencement address, maybe a 5-minute commencement address, not as part of, not the long commencement address, but the short commencement address. And so I thought to myself, what's important here? And what was important to me was to pay attention to the difference between an individual outlook on life or an institutional outlook on life. And by that, what I mean is a lot of people wind up defining success by what institutions consider to be success. They want to live someplace because that's the right place to live. They want to have a certain kind of career because that's respectable. Whatever it is, that they want to go with a certain company because that company is deemed to be a really great company. Not because it's good for them. They subvert what is important to the individual, to what they think the world or an institution says is right. And what you have to do is you have to pay attention to what's right for you as an individual. You have to be willing to take a risk, to live with some uncertainty, and to ignore sometimes what the world thinks is right for you, and just do what you think is right for you.
That's good. That's good. So if I were going to try to summarize what you just said, it would be that the success of a lot of people, they chase what they think is success by what they've heard from others instead of really figuring out what's successful for themselves.
That's right. That's exactly right.
And, if someone wants to get in touch with you, Carl, how's the best way to get in touch with you?
Call you, David. Call you.
Well, give me a call then. That would be great. I will come up. Well,
yeah.
I appreciate you very much. Thanks for being with the call.
Happy to do it. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to The Straight Line to Success. Copyright 2026 Wyatt Sports and Entertainment, LLC. All rights reserved. Visit www.tslts.com and join the TSLTS Insider for exclusive content and updates.
We're doing the best we can. Everybody do your best. Come on, come on. Do your best. Do your best. The best you can.